For more on the Supreme Court and the rest of the day's big stories, it's time to turn things over to our politics panel. On the panel tonight, Heather Sermo, conservative strategist and associate with Blueskin Solutions, who blogs at heathersermo.com, and Richard Fowler, Democratic strategist and host of the Richard Fowler Radio Show. Great to have you both with us.
Great to be here.
Thanks for having me, Tom.
Thanks for joining us. First of all, let's start out right back where what I was just talking with the congressman about. Senator Bernie Sanders had this to say about the Montana ruling today, where the Supreme Court basically reaffirmed Citizens United. Bernie Sanders said, in his famous speech at Gettysburg during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln talked about America as a country of the people, by the people, and for the people. Today, as a result of the Supreme Court's refusal to reconsider its decision in Citizens United, we are rapidly moving toward a nation of the super rich, by the super rich, and for the super rich. That is not what America is supposed to be about. The Supreme Court decision must be overturned. Does anyone disagree?
I disagree. Yes, I know. I'm going to just say it right now. I mean, the whole idea, I mean, you have no evidence that the Koch brothers investing money in, not the campaign, but investing money in ads to support the campaign, right, or, you know, Adelson or whoever you're pointing to, that's corrupting. You have no evidence to point to that. No. I mean, how is that buying votes? I mean, only one person, you can only vote once.
It's not about buying votes, though. It's about buying access. I mean, case in point, let's give one empirical example of where this is true, where big money in our politics have affected congressional decisions. The transportation bill, which is currently on the House floor, that's getting ready to be debated. If it doesn't pass by the 30th, we will lose about 1.9 million jobs. It will create 2.9 million jobs if it passes. But Republicans in the House of Representatives are holding up the bill for the Keystone Pipeline, which will only generate 6,000 jobs. Why? Because of the big oil companies that have given to their campaigns. They're going to hold up the transportation infrastructure of this country for 6,000 jobs.
6,000 vital,
temporary jobs.
There's actually, if you look at the numbers, I think it was 24. I don't remember the numbers of the votes, but all the people who voted to block the transportation bill, unless Keystone is included, received over $100,000 from big oil. All the people who voted to pass the thing without Keystone had received $36,000 or less from big oil. It's just there's this big gap right there, and you can see the numbers.
That's fine. But correlation does not equal causation. I mean, so these are opinions that you have. That's fine, but the reality is that there's no.
Are you telling me, Heather, that if you were a decision maker, and I gave you $1 million, that you would not feel any kind of obligation?
They have money coming from all over the place. They have influences.
I mean, how do you explain, like, earmarking? How do you explain all the pork barrel spending for small pet projects? How do you explain these corporations getting these corporate subsets from Congress if you're saying there's no causation? Has all just happened on accident? We accidentally gave a tax cut to ExxonMobil and Chevron in the bill, and we accidentally did it. We just did it we didn't think about it before we did it. We just accidentally, it just happened.
No, all I'm saying is that you can't just lay the blame. You know, all of our problems in politics, you know, have to do with the billionaires who are giving money to these campaigns. The reality is that anybody can give money to a campaign.
That's not all the problems, just some of them.
You know,
when do we know? When would we? You said we don't know yet. We don't have the evidence. When would we know?
I mean, you'd have to have a solid case to saying, you know, that Adelson gave this money and, you know, this obviously benefited. That, I mean,
more Macau casinos or something. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, just obviously there are problems with our elections. You know, there is a lot of money going into elections. I said this before on this program, that I think that there shouldn't be many restrictions at all on giving to campaigns. I think we'd avoid a lot of problems if we just said, you know what, Heather, if you want to write this amount of money to this campaign, you may. However, there is transparency that comes along with that.
We'll continue that conversation. More with tonight's politics panel after the break. Time to get back to the politics panel. On tonight's panel, Heather Sermo, conservative strategist, associate with Blueskin Solutions and blogger at heathersermo.com, and Richard Fowler, Democratic strategist and host of the Richard Fowler Show. The Supreme Court ruled on Arizona's immigration law, striking down 3 out of the 4 provisions. But I want to talk about what Scalia said in his dissent. He just went off on the president. He said, to say as the court does, and he actually kind of acted it out, that Arizona contradicts federal law by enforcing applications of the Immigration Act that the president declines to enforce boggles the mind. If securing its territory in this fashion is not within the power of Arizona, we should cease referring to it as a sovereign state.
Tone yours, right, Thom?
No, tone is mine, but actually my associate producer was on my radio show was in the room with him when he said it today, and I did that, and he said, you almost got it, that he really, you know, he's very, very...
He's Italian.
Yeah, the audio will be out Thursday. But he's basically saying that Arizona's sovereign. I thought, you know, arguably what he's saying is that they can keep out Californians. Didn't we litigate states' rights in the, and it was called the Civil War? Richard?
No, totally. I think we did litigate state rights in the Civil War. But beyond that, the thing that boggles the mind, especially when it comes to Scalia, is for the fact that he's such a strict constitutionalist, and he's all about, well, what's the letter of the law, what's in the Constitution.
He's not a strict constitutionalist. He just says he is.
However you want to put it.
He calls himself an originalist, like he can read the mind of the founders. Oh, yes, let's go back to those good old days when women couldn't vote and, white people could own slaves.
I'll give you that one, Thom. But I mean, I think one of the powers that are guaranteed to the Congress is the power of naturalization. That's in the Constitution. Therefore, they're responsible for determining what you do to naturalize. If you are not naturalized, what's the consequence of that? All that falls under the power of the Congress. That is a federal enumerated power, and therefore, this law should have been struck down simply because it's unconstitutional for you to enforce something the power that belongs to the Congress.
And Heather, in Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 4, where it says Congress shall create or whatever
establish forms of naturalization.
Consistent. Doesn't it have the word consistent? I'm quite sure. Or uniform.
I believe, yes,
uniform. In other words, they have to be the same across all the states.
Yes, but this is a problem with the federal government under President Obama's watch, not enforcing the border, not
This is a problem.
protecting the border.
No,
and so you have illegals coming in. We're not talking about...
Now listen, I'm willing to blame somebody on this, but let's blame the right person. If Congress is responsible for naturalization and they're responsible for immigration, there needs to be an act of Congress. John Boehner has done absolutely nothing when he was Speaker of the House to do anything for immigration. When Nancy Pelosi was the Speaker, they passed the DREAM Act 3 times, and they all failed in the Senate because of the filibuster, because Republicans filibustered it. The Democrats have tried to make immigration reform, so it really boggles the mind when people make this argument that it's Obama's fault that the 1070 law happened, because it's not. It's the fact that Congress was inactive.
No. The reality is Congress did give more power to the states. Just recently, Congress gave more power to the states to enforce the law. I forget what the law is called. I have my notes right here. But they said that states can enforce, with cooperating with the federal government, can enforce the laws that are in place. If you have illegals coming in, you should be able to do something about that. That part was not struck down
by the Supreme Court.
That's what I'm saying. The heart of the law, and that's why, you know, Jan Brewer came out today, the Arizona governor, and claimed a victory because the heart of the law is still there. You can't pull somebody over just because you suspect that he or she is an illegal. But if you do pull somebody over under another, reason, then you can have reasonable cause to investigate. But
George Herbert Walker Bush, George W. Bush, and Ronald Reagan all issued executive orders. Actually, they even went even farther than President Obama has to selectively enforce immigration law. All 3 of them. Why is it that when Obama does it, a justice on the Supreme Court goes off his rocker?
Well, I think it's because Obama has put himself up against Arizona. I mean, he's pointed his finger at Arizona, and it's gotten Arizona. Obviously they have a very Republican governor, and they have a very outspoken sheriff.
Isn't it that we have one of the most partisan Supreme Courts in history?
How about we have one of the most partisan executive branches in history?
An executive branch is always partisan.
No, I mean, but I actually don't agree with your contention that it's the most partisan Supreme Court. I think that there have been some really weighty issues I've had to consider.
I mean, are you looking at the
Bush v. Gore?
I mean,
they struck down 3 out of 4 of the provisions of the law.
Because they're unconstitutional.
I mean, that was something that...
I'll give you the argument that they struck down the provisions in the Constitution, the provisions of the law that were unconstitutional. But the most important part of this law was they sort of gave credence as to why the DREAM Act should happen. They talked about college students and veterans should not be unnecessarily harassed by state governments for trying to live out their American dream. And that's the most important part. And that's what gives justification to the President's executive order, which allows them to stay here under worker visas, which is not amnesty, it is a worker visa, to stay here and continue their education or continue their military service.
And then one final note about the Supreme Court. That's why this presidential election is so key. And you have Justice Ginsburg, who's on the verge of retirement. Yes, it's not a partisan court. However, it is the Supreme Court justices are appointed by a partisan person.
Partisan process.
So we can't I mean, the Ninth Circuit of California, in California is horrendous. Who appointed that?
Speaking of SCOTUS, of the Supreme Court, it's expected on Thursday that this health care ruling is going to come down. In fact, Scalia announced it. Yeah. And our royal family, the Supreme Court, the ones who, it's amazing. The Queen can dissolve Parliament, the Supreme Court can dissolve our laws. I don't think the founders planned on that. But in any case, if the court strikes down the laws, then 30 million Americans who would have access to health care thanks to Obamacare won't. Insurers will again be able to discriminate against the more than 100 million Americans who have pre-existing conditions and the 2 million children who are being covered right now with pre-existing conditions. Small businesses will no longer receive tax credits to offer their employees insurance. Millions of low-income Americans are going to lose access to Medicaid. More than 3 million young adults under 26 who are on their parents' insurance plans are going to get tossed off. And seniors, the donut hole is going to open back up and they're going to pay more for their drugs. Who really loses if Obamacare is struck down? It seems to me, Heather, that the Republicans are going to, be in a tough position.
The reality is there are a host of possibilities the Supreme Court could render, on Thursday. We could have the law intact, completely intact, which some legal scholars I know say that is likely to happen. But the next scenario is that the individual mandate will be ruled unconstitutional.
Right.
But then there are other parts of the bill or the law that are attached to the individual mandate, which who knows how those will be implemented. Because for one thing, you have the pre-existing conditions that are going to be obliterated with the law being enacted.
Right, without
the individual mandate, then you could get a sickness and say, insurance company, you got to cover me.
Right, without
insurance companies are going to be
without the Heritage Foundation Romney mandate, which it should be called. The Heritage Foundation first proposed it, and Romney was the first guy to put it into law. Without that mandate, a lot of the rest of the bill doesn't work. Richard,
well, that's exactly right. I think what we're dealing with on the Supreme Court is dealing with the situation that if they act the wrong way, they could really harm tons and tons and tons of millions of Americans. Americans think that Obamacare is unpopular, the name. But when it comes to the actual parts of the bill, this is a recent poll that came out that said this, they actually like those parts. They like the fact that donut hole is closed. They like the fact their kids can go back on their insurance. They like all these portions. And when this bill, if they decide to be a political Supreme Court and overturn this bill, is going to harm a lot of Americans. And I think Romney has two questions. Romney's number one question is, what am I going to do when this happens? How am I going to solve this problem? How am I going to solve 2.5 million young people not having health insurance in this country? How am I going to solve little kids who have asthma not getting help, not being able to get their treatment?
Now, I'm not going to buy. Okay, Obamacare is not. I'm not going to say that it's totally evil, but I'm not going to buy that it's going to solve all of our problems either. And most Americans don't even understand.
In fact, I'm curious.
It's not a perfect law by any stretch.
What both of you would say to those progressives who are standing out in front of the Supreme Court today saying, please strike down all of Obamacare because it'll create such a crisis that then we'll be forced to go, okay, we're going to drop the Medicare eligibility age down to 0. We'll have a national single-payer health care program. Everything will be wonderful. I mean, there's actually a substantial, I don't know if it's a substantial number, but they're quite loud, who are saying this.
I completely disagree with them. I think that is the worst thing that we can do in this country. Understandable, comprehensive health care reform and the American Affordable Care Act is not the best piece of law we have, but it's what we could get done. And I think the consequences are worse if it repeals and we have this Congress have to make this decision, or even the next Congress, we're going to be really up the creek without a paddle. And I think it's the worst thing that we could do.
And I think one thing that should also not be overlooked, and Thom, I'd be interested to hear what you had to say about this, because I think it's a violation of the First Amendment, is the whole religious freedom aspect of the health care law. That there is a mandate that Catholic hospitals, that places that are not just places of worship, have to cover.
Hospitals are not places of worship.
That's what I'm saying. That places that are not places of worship.
Right.
So hospitals that are affiliated with.
If a church wants to run a business on the side, and use the revenue from that business to support the church, they should have to conform to the laws of business.
I agree.
I think that is a complete violation.
Not at all. It's one thing.
Many Americans feel that
no,
too.
No. But let's break this down for a second.
No, because most Americans think that we're talking about churches.
Yeah, but see that if you allow that exemption, if you allow that to happen, the First Amendment, I think, really starts to lose all kinds of weight.
No, I think
I can't speak my views outside of the church. Like I can't.
No, that's not what the argument is, though. That's not what the argument is. The argument that the president's made, and the argument that the Affordable Care Act makes, is that if you are employed by a charitable organization, i.e., a church would be one of those, and you have the right to get health care, you have the right to get birth control, because you might work at the church and not prescribe to the church's religion, and that's your First Amendment right to have the freedom to do what your freedom of expression.
But the church also has the right, and this gets lost in the argument, the church has the right to say, no, we're not going to provide birth control to people, because it's a church. They just don't, they lose that right when they step into the realm of commerce.
See, but I think that is losing the whole
but they're not being a church when they're doing commerce anymore.
So that means that I as a Baptist, let's say, as long as I'm in the church, I can have all kinds of views and live out my life in any way. If I go into a business environment, I can't.
It's your employer. Your employer can discriminate.
I think the repercussions of that, the extrapolation of that argument.
I mean, what are the what's already happened? What's the extrapolations? Is like there's something happening with churches that we're missing?
Yeah. Okay. Well, we're going to have to wrap it up here.
If this goes through, then you're going to have to mandate.
Yeah. We're out of time. Heather, great argument. Richard,
well, it's not my argument. It's one of the reasons that people are against Obamacare, too. There's so many reasons.
No, I get it. There's a big debate here. Heather Sermo, Richard Fowler, thank you both for being with us tonight.